Did Napoleon really have a fear of cats? Did Vikings wear horned helmets into battle? Or was Cleopatra even Egyptian at all? For centuries, these so-called facts have been taught in classrooms, whispered in museums, and passed along like sacred truths. But what if many of them never happened? In this deep dive, we'll uncover the top 100 lies, myths, and errors in history. And the final chapter, that one might just change how you see everything. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of long, gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Now lower your lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and settle in. Let's ease into tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 1: Kings, Queens, and Royal Lies. The image of a ruler has always been larger than life. Cloaked in opulence, draped in mystery, and bolstered by legend, monarchs from every corner of the world have stood not just as leaders, but as symbols. Yet, many of the stories told about them have nothing to do with reality. They were spun to control a narrative, to inspire loyalty, or to terrify enemies. The tale of Marie Antoinette allegedly urging the poor to eat cake while starving is one of the most repeated lines in history. But it never came from her lips. It was born from anger, propaganda, and the mob's desire to assign blame. This myth painted her as detached and cruel when, in truth, she may have been no more disconnected than any royal born into power. Yet history remembers the line, not the person. And she's not alone. Monarchs throughout history have lived in the shadows of stories they never authored. Nero, the infamous Roman emperor, is often blamed for watching his city burn while playing a fiddle. It's a powerful image. Flames engulfing Rome, and a ruler so disconnected he performs a song. But the fiddle didn't even exist in Nero's time. The myth likely emerged decades later, twisted and exaggerated by political enemies who wanted to vilify him. Nero did rule during the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64, but reports say he was not even in the city when it began. He returned, helped with relief efforts, and even opened his own gardens to the homeless. Still, rumors persisted. He became a symbol of tyranny not because of what he did, but because of how others chose to remember him. The story of the fiddle wasn't a fact. It was a dagger made of lies, and it stuck. Once again, history favored the drama over the truth. Another royal burdened by historical fiction is Richard III. The popular image of him, a hunchbacked villain who murdered his young nephews to steal the English throne, comes largely from dramatists and enemies. Most notably, Shakespeare's portrayal helped turn Richard into a monster in the public imagination. But modern historians have cast doubt on many of those claims. For one, there's limited evidence he was physically deformed. His remains, discovered beneath a parking lot in Leicester in 2012, showed a curvature of the spine, not the grotesque appearance described in plays. As for the princes in the tower, their disappearance remains a mystery. Richard may have been responsible, or he may not, but the certainty with which history has labeled him is based less on fact and more on the need for a scapegoat in a messy war of succession. A man's legacy turned into a stage act, performed again and again. The tale of Catherine the Great dying in a scandalous and unnatural way has lived on in whispers for centuries. The truth, it never happened. The Empress of Russia, one of the most powerful and influential monarchs in European history, died peacefully in bed from a stroke in 1796. The grotesque rumor surrounding her death was entirely fabricated, likely by enemies who despised the idea of a strong woman ruling an empire. Catherine expanded Russian territory, modernized its government, and was a towering intellect of her time. Yet her memory has been stained by a vicious lie, repeated often because of its shock value. This was not an accident. It was weaponized gossip, crafted to reduce a formidable leader to a joke. Her real achievements, which should have secured her a towering legacy, are too often eclipsed by a story that was never real to begin with. Let's shift to King George III, the British monarch infamous for going mad and losing the American colonies. The truth is far more complex. George did suffer from a medical condition, likely a metabolic disorder such as porphyria, that affected his mental health. But to depict him as a raving lunatic who recklessly drove away his empire ignores the facts. His government operated with Parliament, and many of the decisions that led to war with America were collective, not the whims of one unhinged man. The narrative of the Mad King was crafted both during and after his reign by political opponents and dramatists seeking to simplify a complicated figure. It made for a better story, especially across the Atlantic. The image of a crazed monarch helped justify rebellion. But it wasn't the full truth. The real George III was sick, yes, but he was not the caricature that history painted. Ivan the Terrible of Russia earned his nickname through chilling stories of cruelty, including the tale of him murdering his own son in a fit of rage. A famous painting shows Ivan cradling his dying boy, horror etched into his face. It's a powerful piece of art, but historians debate whether the event actually happened. Contemporary records are suspiciously quiet about it. Some believe the murder story was amplified or entirely invented by those who wanted to cement Ivan's reign as a warning, a cautionary tale of power gone mad. Ivan was undeniably harsh. He executed nobles, waged brutal wars, and centralized power with an iron fist. But the patricide claim remains murky. Even in death, the memory of rulers like Ivan becomes a tool, reshaped by each generation to fit their own moral message. Truth becomes optional when the goal is legend. There's another name who endures in infamy: Caligula, the Roman emperor whose name became synonymous with insanity, cruelty, and decadence. He's said to have made his horse a senator, bathed in gold, and declared himself a god. But when we peel back the stories, most of these claims come from sources written long after his death, often by authors who despised him or relied on hearsay. The story of the horse, for example, may have been satire, an emperor mocking the Senate by threatening to elevate a beast above them. Over time, the joke became legend, then legend became fact in the public imagination. Caligula certainly ruled with excess and violence, but the wildest stories likely reflect the biases of Roman historians more than objective truth. In the end, even monsters may be made, not born, when history becomes entertainment. Queen Elizabeth I, often remembered as the Virgin Queen, is another monarch surrounded by crafted mythology. Her refusal to marry and her identification as a pure, divine ruler gave rise to the idea that she remained chaste for England's sake. But reality was more complicated. Her image was carefully cultivated by advisors who saw the value in promoting a queen married only to her realm. It strengthened loyalty and avoided messy political entanglements. Whether Elizabeth had secret lovers or personal relationships that went unrecorded is still debated. But what's clear is that the image of her as an untouched symbol of virtue was largely political theater. It served a purpose in her time and became part of her legacy. But it wasn't necessarily fact. Monarchs have always been shaped to fit the needs of the story people want to believe. Charlemagne, the great unifier of Western Europe, is sometimes depicted as a flawless Christian warrior king, spreading faith and justice across the continent. But his reign was marked by violent campaigns, forced conversions, and brutal suppression of dissent. The myth of a benevolent father of Europe was promoted centuries later, especially during times when unity and religious identity needed a patron saint. His darker deeds were downplayed or forgotten, replaced with tales of noble conquest and divine mission. The truth is, Charlemagne was both a statesman and a warlord, a reformer and a tyrant. But history preferred the cleaner version, the one that could be used in textbooks and political speeches. So the complexity was carved away, and the myth endured. Once again, we see how the past bends under the weight of convenience. One of the most absurd stories is about Emperor Claudius and the supposed invention of the letter G. While Claudius did propose some changes to the Latin alphabet, including a new character or two, the idea that he invented a major letter or revolutionized language is vastly overstated. The claim comes from fragments of Roman records and was amplified by later scholars looking to ascribe genius to a man often mocked in his lifetime. Claudius had physical disabilities and a reputation for awkwardness, so when he rose to power, his supporters scrambled to enhance his image. Inventions, reforms, and intellectual pursuits were highlighted, regardless of their actual impact. History was rewritten not just by victors, but by spin doctors even in ancient Rome. Facts became tools, and truth once again was shaped to fit a crown. Finally, we come to the idea that monarchs ruled alone. The lone, all-powerful king issuing decrees from a throne is a dramatic image. But most kings and queens, especially in Europe, relied heavily on councils, ministers, and courts. Their power was often checked by nobles, parliaments, or even the church. The myth of absolute monarchy made sense for portraits and propaganda, but the truth was messier. Behind every crown stood a web of influence, negotiation, and compromise. Monarchs were rarely as omnipotent as their portraits suggest. But power, like history, often needs a face. So the myth of solitary rule persists, simplifying a complex dance of politics into a single, commanding figure. It's a lie that continues today, echoing through classrooms and documentaries, where drama still takes precedence over depth. And that's where history often falters, when it chooses spectacle over substance. Chapter 10. The greatest historical hoaxes ever pulled. Some lies are so carefully crafted, so intricately woven into the fabric of history, that they become indistinguishable from truth. This chapter begins with a forgery that shaped empires, the donation of Constantine. For centuries, the Catholic Church claimed this document as proof that Emperor Constantine had gifted vast territories and authority to the Pope. It granted the Church supreme temporal power over Western Europe. But in the 15th century, scholars realized it was fake. The language used in the document didn't match the time period. Yet for over 1,000 years, popes used it as a divine stamp of rule. It's not just that the lie existed, it shaped kingdoms, justified wars, and built an empire of influence on pure fiction. The donation wasn't just a lie. It was one of the most powerful illusions in world history, reminding us how easily authority can be built on parchment and belief. Then came the Priory of Chaon, an alleged secret society said to protect the bloodline of Jesus Christ. The myth exploded in modern times, fueled by conspiracy theories and popular novels. But the truth is far less dramatic. The Priory of Chaon was invented in the 1950s by a Frenchman named Pierre Plantard, who forged documents and planted them in libraries to support his tale. He wanted to make himself seem like a descendant of royalty. The elaborate network of symbols, codes, and bloodlines? Entirely fabricated. Yet this hoax grew, pulling in authors, filmmakers, and conspiracy theorists who spun it into a modern legend. The impact of the lie shows how easily history can be manipulated when people want to believe something greater is hidden beneath the surface. The Priory never existed, but it changed how millions viewed religion, history, and secret societies. Another famous case of deception came in the form of ancient war stories, the Trojan War. For centuries, people believed Homer's Iliad to be historical truth. The great wooden horse, the face that launched 1,000 ships, the fall of Troy, all were treated as actual events. But archaeological digs reveal a different picture. There was a city of Troy, yes, and it was likely destroyed multiple times over centuries. But the sweeping narrative of gods, heroes, and epic battles? That's literature, not documentation. Homer's account was an oral tradition passed down and embellished for generations before being written down. The lines between history and myth blurred so completely that for centuries people fought over ruins and relics based on a fictional war. It's not that nothing happened. It's that what people believed happened was a spectacular embellishment. Then there's the mysterious case of the Piltdown Man. In the early 20th century, scientists believed they had discovered the missing link between apes and humans in an English gravel pit. Fossils showed a human-like skull with an ape-like jaw. It shocked the world and reshaped theories of evolution. But decades later, it was revealed as a hoax. The skull was human. The jaw was from an orangutan, and the teeth had been filed down to fit. The forger used chemicals to make the bones look ancient. Scientists were deceived for over 40 years, and research was based on a lie. This was not just a prank. It distorted the course of scientific inquiry for a generation. The Piltdown Man is a reminder that even science, when not questioned, can become prey to belief over evidence. In a darker twist, we arrive at the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a vile forgery with deadly consequences. Supposedly the minutes of a secret meeting of Jewish leaders plotting global domination, it was actually written by agents of the Russian Tsar in the early 1900s. The goal was to fuel anti-Semitism and justify repression. It worked. The protocols spread rapidly, translated into dozens of languages, and used by hate groups and dictators, including the Nazis. Even after being debunked, it persisted. This wasn't just a hoax, it was a weapon disguised as a document. The protocols show how a lie can become a tool of destruction, inciting fear and justifying atrocities across generations. Next comes the Hitler Diaries. In the 1980s, German magazine Stern claimed to have uncovered Adolf Hitler's personal journals. The world was shocked. Scholars rushed to analyze them. But within weeks, experts revealed the truth. The diaries were fake. clumsy forgeries riddled with historical inaccuracies and cheap materials. Yet the hoax nearly succeeded because the desire for sensational discoveries overpowered cautious skepticism. The story shows how history's villains can be turned into obsessions and how media, when careless, can amplify a lie faster than truth can catch up. The Hitler diaries weren't just about money or fame. They were a reminder that even in the modern age, historical truth is fragile. We then have the case of the Shroud of Turin. For centuries, this linen cloth was believed by many to be the burial shroud of Jesus, bearing his image. Pilgrims traveled across countries to see it. Scientists later carbon dated it to the Middle Ages, long after Jesus lived. The image on the shroud, likely created by artistic methods of the time. While some still believe in its authenticity, the majority of experts now view it as a medieval forgery. Yet its power lies in belief. Whether real or not, it inspired devotion, awe, and debate, and it proves how religious relics, even when unproven, can shape history and culture through their very presence. Another historical distortion comes from the legend of Pope Joan, a woman who supposedly disguised herself as a man and rose to become pope in the Middle Ages. Her story included dramatic details: childbirth during a procession, public outrage, and erasure from history. But most scholars now agree there is no evidence she ever existed. The tale likely originated from satire or anti-papal propaganda. Still, it persisted for centuries, embedded in church lore and popular belief. Pope Joan reflects a recurring theme: how stories born of rumor or rebellion can embed themselves into collective memory so deeply they feel real, even when they never were. The Cardiff Giant is a more humorous example. In 1869, a massive petrified man was unearthed in New York. People believed it was a fossilized ancient giant. Crowds came from all over to witness it, but it was a hoax, a sculpture buried by a man named George Hull to mock literal interpretations of the Bible. Despite being exposed as fake, it still drew thousands. Because people wanted to believe giants once walked the earth. The Cardiff Giant shows how spectacle often outweighs substance. Even when a lie is exposed, the desire for wonder makes people ignore the truth. Finally, we reach the last twist, a hoax not from the past, but perhaps from the present. What if much of what we accept as historical truth today is being shaped, filtered, or even fabricated by modern systems? From curated textbooks to controlled media, from AI-generated documents to politically motivated archives, we are entering an age where it will become harder than ever to know what is real. Future generations may believe things we know are false. They may reject truths we hold dear. The greatest historical hoax may not be behind us. It may be the version of now that we leave behind. History is not only written by the victors, it is rewritten by the believers, and belief is the most powerful forger of all. Chapter 2: False Flags of War. There is something seductive about the stories we tell of war. Battles become legend, heroes are born in fire, and acts of bravery are passed down like sacred heirlooms. But what if many of these tales never actually happened? What if some of the most cherished wartime moments were nothing more than carefully crafted myths? The truth is, history often paints war in broad strokes, with heroes forged not by action, but by narrative. Take the story of George Washington chopping down a cherry tree. It's meant to show a young boy's honesty and moral character, but there is no record of it during his lifetime. It first appeared decades later in a biography designed to elevate his reputation. It was fiction sold as fact, and it stuck. Not because it was true, but because it was useful. In war, as in peace, stories are weapons. And sometimes the most dangerous ones are the ones people want to believe. Then there is Paul Revere's famous Midnight Ride. The lone patriot racing through the dark countryside, warning Americans that the British were coming. It's a thrilling image, a cinematic moment. But the truth is, Revere was not alone. Others, like William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, also rode that night, and one of them even made it farther than Revere did. In fact, Revere was briefly detained by British forces and never completed the full ride himself. The version we know today was popularized by a poem written nearly a century later. It turned a collaborative act into a solo legend. The poet needed a central figure, so Revere became the chosen one. The others were forgotten. This wasn't history, it was marketing. And the truth was quietly left behind in favor of a cleaner, simpler myth. One name, one ride, one nation on the brink of war. The Spartans are another example. They are often remembered as the ultimate warriors, disciplined, fearless, and devoted to glory and honor. Movies and books have turned them into symbols of masculine perfection. But much of this image is exaggerated. Sparta was a militarized society, yes, but also a deeply flawed one. They practiced infanticide, enslaved entire populations, and their famed discipline often bordered on cruelty. The Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans supposedly held off 1,000,000 Persians, is a prime example. In reality, they were not alone. Thousands of Greek allies fought and died alongside them, and the Persian numbers were likely far fewer than the mythical 1,000,000. The story became inflated over time, growing into a legend of sacrifice. But behind the legend lies propaganda, a need for heroes, a desire to simplify a chaotic and brutal war into something noble, something easy to digest. That simplification is where the truth often dies. The American Civil War has its share of embellished moments as well. One often repeated tale involves the Confederate General Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson, said to have stood like a stone wall during battle, inspiring his troops with his calm resolve. But this nickname may have been misinterpreted. Some historians believe it was meant as an insult during a chaotic moment of inaction, not praise. The phrase stuck, though, and Jackson became a symbol of unshakable courage. His death was later romanticized too. Accidentally shot by his own men, his final words described as poetic and serene. But battlefield confusion is rarely that clean. The truth is messy, and yet generations were taught a version of events sanitized for emotional impact. Jackson's story was polished to inspire future soldiers and uphold a particular view of Southern honor. But at its heart, it was just another fable wrapped in flags. World War I introduced the myth of the Christmas truce, a story where British and German soldiers laid down arms on Christmas Eve, sang carols, and played football in no man's land. It did happen in some places, but it wasn't widespread, nor was it a grand moment of peace across the entire Western Front. Most sectors saw no such truce, and after that year, such fraternization was discouraged or outright punished. The myth, however, grew with time. It became a symbol of humanity amidst horror, a comforting illusion that even in the bloodiest wars, people could find connection. But emphasizing this isolated moment can distort the true horror of trench warfare, mustard gas, and senseless slaughter. It gives us a heartwarming pause in a story that was, in reality, relentless suffering. That's the danger of a beautiful myth. It can soothe us into forgetting what really happened. During World War II, the idea that Winston Churchill stood alone in defiance against Hitler is deeply ingrained in popular culture. But Britain was never entirely alone. Its empire stretched across the globe, bringing resources and manpower from colonies like India, Australia, and Africa. Polish pilots defended the skies over London. French resistance fighters sabotaged German operations. The narrative of Britain's solitary stand simplifies a global struggle into a single island's triumph. It ignores the sacrifices of millions who fought under foreign flags, underappreciated and often forgotten. Churchill himself promoted the narrative, understanding its power. But the truth was broader, more collective, and far more nuanced. Simplifying it into one man's stand against tyranny diminishes the scale of the war and the people who gave their lives to fight it. The myth comforts, the truth humbles, but only one helps us truly understand the cost of global conflict. Napoleon Bonaparte's military genius is often framed through the lens of one disastrous decision: invading Russia in the winter. The popular version claims he underestimated the weather, leading to the destruction of his grand army. While the campaign was disastrous, the myth of Napoleon being defeated by snow is misleading. His army suffered most during the summer due to supply shortages, disease, and scorched earth tactics used by retreating Russian forces. By the time winter arrived, the army was already decimated. The weather did play a role, but it was far from the only reason. Blaming it solely on winter oversimplifies the complexity of the campaign and removes the strategic miscalculations, the overconfidence, and the logistical nightmares Napoleon faced. In war, failure is rarely caused by one thing, but myths love single culprits. And in this case, snow became the villain instead of hubris, ambition, and mismanagement. The myth of kamikaze pilots during World War II is often misunderstood. These suicide attacks by Japanese pilots are seen as fanatical, voluntary sacrifices rooted in devotion to the emperor. But many of these pilots were coerced, manipulated, or misled. Letters and testimonies from survivors reveal the immense pressure placed on young men to die for honor. Some were barely trained. Others cried as they left. The romantic image of the fearless, eager warrior is propaganda, a narrative pushed by the Japanese military and later by Allied interpretations of enemy fanaticism. The truth is darker, sadder, and more human. These were often boys caught in machinery far beyond their control. They weren't all zealots. Some were just scared kids. But war stories are rarely allowed to show weakness, especially not in the enemy. So the myth persists, dehumanizing both sides in favor of clean-cut tales of loyalty and sacrifice. The idea that Native American warriors used only primitive weapons against technologically superior American forces during the Indian Wars is another distortion. Tribes across the continent adapted quickly to firearms, horses, and new tactics. In some cases, they outmatched their opponents in mobility and strategy. The myth of the noble but doomed warrior fits neatly into a story of inevitable American progress. But it ignores the complexity and skill of indigenous resistance. Leaders like Tecumseh, Geronimo, and Crazy Horse weren't just reacting to threats. They were organizing vast alliances, strategizing across regions and sometimes winning. The battles were not as one-sided as schoolbooks suggest, but simplifying them helps justify expansion, colonization, and displacement. When the enemy is portrayed as under-equipped and outmatched, their loss feels less like a tragedy and more like destiny. And so, history shrinks real resistance into brief, hopeless gestures rather than recognizing them as fierce fights for survival. The myth of the Trojan horse, often accepted as historical fact, is rooted more in literature than archaeology. There is no conclusive evidence that a wooden horse was ever used to infiltrate Troy. The story comes primarily from epic poetry, not military records. If there was a war at Troy, it likely didn't involve divine meddling or cunning wooden sculptures. Instead, it may have been a mundane siege over trade routes and political alliances. But that version is less exciting. So we remember the horse, the trickery, the fall of a city to a bold idea. It's a perfect wartime parable, one that has endured for millennia, but its endurance doesn't prove its truth. It proves our love of drama, our craving for symbolism, and our willingness to let imagination fill in the cracks of history. Sometimes we want the lie to be true because it feels better than the truth ever could. Finally, there's the image of soldiers in every war eagerly marching off to glory, full of patriotism and purpose. But diaries, letters, and oral histories paint a very different picture. Many soldiers were conscripted, others enlisted out of economic desperation. Fear, confusion, and homesickness were far more common than pride. The idea of marching off with heads held high was often manufactured by governments and media to maintain morale at home. Propaganda posters showed smiling faces, but reality was filled with dread. People left behind their families not for glory, but because they had no choice. War stories that begin with cheers often end in silence. And yet, we keep starting them the same way, because the lie is more palatable than the truth. We want our heroes brave, our enemies evil, and our wars just. But history, real history, is never that simple. And that is perhaps the biggest battlefield myth of all. Chapter 3: Ancient Civilizations We've Misunderstood. For centuries, ancient civilizations have been romanticized or demonized through myths, mistranslations, and wild assumptions. These distant cultures, Egyptians, Greeks, Mayans, and others, are often viewed through a distorted lens, shaped more by folklore than fact. One of the most persistent tales is that Egyptian tombs were cursed, striking down those who dared to disturb them. The idea surged after the 1922 discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb, when several expedition members died soon after. Newspapers ran wild with stories of supernatural revenge. But science had another explanation: mold, toxins, and coincidence. Most of the team lived long, healthy lives. The idea of an ancient curse was just more exciting than reality. It sold papers, thrilled the public, and wrapped history in mystery. Yet Egyptians weren't obsessed with curses. They revered the dead, but their focus was on protection, not vengeance. What we now call a curse was more a plea to be left in peace, not a magical trap for greedy archaeologists. Another popular myth paints the Mayans as doomsday prophets who predicted the world would end in 2012. This claim sparked panic, documentaries, and even disaster films. But the truth is less dramatic. The Mayan long count calendar did end a cycle that year, but it never predicted destruction. Instead, It marked the close of one Bacton and the start of another, like turning a page in a calendar, not smashing the whole book. The misunderstanding came from trying to interpret ancient beliefs through a modern, Western fear of apocalypse. Scholars and actual Mayan descendants repeatedly explained the peaceful intent of the date. But the myth thrived because people craved mystery and danger. The Mayans, who were master astronomers and mathematicians, became reduced to false prophets. Their deep legacy of architecture, agriculture, and governance was drowned in a wave of fictional fear-mongering. Once again, real history lost to sensationalism. The Greeks are often credited with inventing democracy, but the system they created in Athens was far from the idealized model taught in classrooms. It excluded women, slaves, and anyone not born in Athens. In fact, a large portion of the population had no say in public matters at all. What they built was a prototype, not a utopia. The idea of the pure, noble Greek citizen casting votes under olive trees is mostly myth. Their democracy was experimental, unstable, and often corrupt. Leaders were frequently exiled or executed. Power shifted quickly, and public opinion could turn deadly. Still, their efforts laid groundwork for future systems, but to say they invented modern democracy is misleading. It flatters the past while ignoring its flaws. Real history is never as clean as the tribute we pay it. It's messy, exclusionary, and often cruel. But in that mess lies the truth, if we're willing to look beyond the marble statues. The fall of the Roman Empire is usually blamed on decadence and moral collapse. The image is clear. Romans grew lazy, indulged in excess, and ignored the threats at their borders. But historians today see a different story. Rome's fall was not a single event, nor a punishment for moral failure. It was a slow, complex decline driven by economic troubles, climate shifts, political fragmentation, and external pressures. The eastern half, after all, survived for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire. The idea of a decadent collapse was promoted by later writers, especially those with Christian agendas, eager to contrast pagan corruption with Christian virtue. The myth fit neatly into sermons and parables, but it ignored the real problems: logistics, plague, invasions, and mismanagement. Rome didn't fall because it partied too hard. It fell because empires are fragile, especially when stretched too thin. History rarely collapses in one night. It crumbles over decades, sometimes centuries, in silence. The notion that the Great Pyramids were built by slaves has been repeated for generations. It paints ancient Egypt as a civilization built on suffering, its monuments rising from whipped backs and broken bones. But modern archaeology tells a different story. The builders of the pyramids were skilled laborers, likely conscripted or hired seasonally, and well-fed. They lived in nearby workers' villages with access to medical care, beer, and decent housing. Their tombs were found close to the pyramids, a sign of honor, not servitude. The slave myth was promoted by early historians and popularized in media, reinforcing colonial and biblical narratives. It allowed later cultures to look down on Egypt as both glorious and cruel. But the evidence shows that these monuments were a national project, not a nightmare of oppression. The real story is more human, more complex, and more respectful of the people who shaped stone into eternity. The Indus Valley Civilization, one of the world's oldest urban societies, is often overlooked in favor of Egypt and Mesopotamia, and when it is remembered, it's usually portrayed as primitive or mysterious. But this ancient civilization had city planning, sewage systems, standardized weights, and a peaceful culture with minimal signs of warfare. The myth of early societies being chaotic or violent doesn't hold here. In fact, the Indus people may have avoided centralized power altogether. There are no grand palaces, no obvious temples, and no evidence of kings. This challenges the narrative that civilization must be led by rulers to thrive. Yet, because they left few decipherable writings, they've been cast as enigmatic or incomplete. The truth is, their sophistication rivals any other ancient culture. But their quiet efficiency doesn't fit the story we expect from history. And so, their brilliance is hidden under layers of myth, silence, and disinterest. The Aztecs are widely remembered as bloodthirsty warriors obsessed with human sacrifice. And yes, they did practice ritual killings, often in religious ceremonies. But focusing only on this aspect distorts who they were. The Aztecs built a massive empire, engineered complex aqueducts, cultivated vast markets, and developed advanced education systems. The image of constant slaughter was magnified by Spanish conquerors, who used it to justify brutal colonization. To portray the Aztecs as savages made conquest feel like salvation. But the truth is that sacrifice, while horrific by today's standards, was religiously symbolic, similar in function to other ancient rituals around the world. It did not define the entire culture. The myth of endless bloodshed strips away their achievements and frames them as villains in a European narrative. But they were farmers, engineers, poets, and priests. Their society was rich and layered, not just painted in blood. China's ancient history is filled with towering inventions and dynastic grandeur. Yet one myth has clung tightly, that the Great Wall of China can be seen from the moon. This claim is repeated in textbooks and trivia games, but it is completely false. The wall, while long, is narrow and blends with the natural terrain. Astronauts have confirmed that it's invisible without aid. The myth likely began as a symbol of national pride, a way to illustrate the wall's magnificence. But instead of relying on the wall's real achievements, its strategic importance, the labor it took, and the cultures it protected, the false claim became more popular. It reflects our habit of inflating symbols until they burst. The truth is still impressive, but it doesn't need cosmic exaggeration. Ancient China's accomplishments stand tall on their own. They just got buried under a lie meant to impress. Babylon is often remembered solely for its decadence and the legend of the Tower of Babel, where languages were supposedly confused as punishment for human arrogance. But the historical city was a marvel of architecture, law, and astronomy. The Hanging Gardens, another legendary structure, may not have even existed in Babylon at all. Some scholars suggest they were located in Nineveh instead. These inaccuracies grew over centuries, shaped by religious narratives and second-hand accounts. Babylon was demonized by later empires and spiritual texts as a symbol of corruption. But it was also the place where some of the earliest laws were written and the heavens were mapped with precision. The myths overshadow its real contributions. By painting Babylon as a moral cautionary tale, we overlook its legacy of innovation. The city was more than a warning. It was a wonder, just not the kind we were taught. The Phoenicians are frequently reduced to one idea, that they invented the alphabet. While they did develop one of the earliest alphabetic systems, they didn't invent writing itself, nor were they alone in influencing modern language. Egyptian hieroglyphs, Mesopotamian cuneiform, and others all played a role. The myth of the Phoenician alphabet as a solitary achievement simplifies a long, interconnected evolution of communication. Civilizations shared, borrowed, and modified systems for centuries. The Phoenician script became a foundation, yes, but it was one brick in a much older wall. The desire to credit one group with a world-changing idea erases the messy truth that progress is usually collaborative, accidental, and slow. The alphabet didn't emerge in a flash of brilliance. It emerged from trade, necessity, and trial and error. But the myth of singular genius is easier to celebrate. And so we misremember the road that letters took to reach us. Atlantis, the legendary lost city, is perhaps the most famous example of how we misinterpret ancient tales. Originally described by Plato, Atlantis was likely meant as a philosophical allegory, not a historical location. But people across centuries treated it as real, searching oceans and continents for proof. Some claimed it was in the Mediterranean. Others said it sank near the Bahamas. Yet no credible evidence has ever surfaced. The desire to believe in Atlantis speaks to a deeper human need for mystery, for perfection lost, for a civilization that had it all and then vanished. But in chasing this ghost, we ignore the very real ancient cities buried under sand and sea, filled with real people, real struggles, and real brilliance. Atlantis was never about a place. It was about a warning, but we turned it into a treasure hunt, and in doing so, forgot the lesson it was meant to teach. History is not a straight line. It's a labyrinth of guesses, assumptions, and rediscoveries. Ancient civilizations left behind clues, not answers. We decode them through our own lenses, often tinted by culture, religion, or fantasy. Myths fill the gaps. They offer drama, simplicity, and wonder, but they also erase, distort, and rewrite. To truly understand the past, we must be willing to let go of stories that feel good and confront those that feel strange, even uncomfortable. The truth is always there, buried beneath the legends, waiting to be unearthed, one layer at a time. Chapter 4: Myths in Science and Discovery. It's easy to imagine science as a battlefield of ideas, with heroes challenging ignorance and villains clinging to superstition. The story we're told is full of rebels punished for telling the truth, martyrs of knowledge. But history doesn't quite work like that. One of the most repeated myths is that Galileo was imprisoned for claiming the Earth revolves around the sun. In reality, his conflict with the Church was more political and personal than most people realize. He was placed under house arrest, not exactly chained in a dungeon, and his ideas were already being debated among scholars long before. The image of him as a lone, silenced genius is inspiring, but not entirely accurate. Like many other historical stories, this one was shaped over time to simplify a complex struggle between belief systems, politics, and personalities. The drama sells better than the truth. But once you pull apart the myth, you find something far more human and far less convenient. Another common legend is that Christopher Columbus proved the Earth was round. But by the late 1400s, almost every educated person in Europe already knew it wasn't flat. Ancient Greeks had calculated the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy over 1,000 years before Columbus set sail. What Columbus misjudged wasn't the shape of the planet, it was its size. He believed Asia was much closer to Europe than it actually was. When he stumbled upon the Americas, he thought he had reached the East Indies. The flat Earth myth was actually popularized centuries later as part of a false narrative pitting brave explorers against ignorant medieval minds. The truth is that Columbus's real gamble wasn't about proving a round Earth. It was about navigating a dangerous ocean with wildly wrong maps. He got lucky, and then the myth took over, turning a flawed expedition into a genius triumph. Another science myth that refuses to die is the tale of Isaac Newton discovering gravity when an apple hit him on the head. It's a tidy story, a moment of inspiration, a falling apple, a sudden realization. But Newton's theory of gravity wasn't born from a bump on the head. It was developed slowly, after years of study in mathematics, physics, and astronomy. He considered the motion of the moon, the tides, and the orbits of planets. The apple anecdote likely came from later retellings that tried to simplify a complex intellectual journey into a charming parable. It makes Newton seem more relatable, more magical. But real science isn't magic. It's messy. It's long hours and unanswered questions. The apple never fell to spark a miracle. It fell to feed a myth people wanted to believe. The story of Thomas Edison inventing the light bulb is another tale that leaves out far too much. Edison didn't invent it. He improved it. Dozens of inventors had been working on electric light before Edison entered the scene. Some of them had already produced working prototypes. What Edison did brilliantly was refine the design, secure patents, and market the invention better than anyone else. He built a business empire around it, crafting his image as the lone genius. That myth helped sell his inventions and his legacy. But in reality, science has always been a collaborative, cumulative process. No one person ever creates something from nothing. Edison stood on the shoulders of many others, some of whom history has forgotten. But the idea of the solitary inventor is more inspiring. So it's the one we remember. Consider Benjamin Franklin's famous kite experiment. The image of Franklin flying a kite in a thunderstorm to prove that lightning is electricity is burned into our collective memory. But there are serious doubts about whether the event happened exactly as described, or if it happened at all. Even if it did, it was reckless. Lightning is unpredictable and deadly. The experiment, as told, risks making science seem like daring spectacle rather than careful inquiry. Moreover, other scientists in Europe had already been exploring the link between electricity and lightning. Franklin may have contributed, but he wasn't the first. Still, the story gives us a clean, dramatic moment of discovery. It tells us what we want to hear, that one man with courage and creativity can unlock the mysteries of nature in a single strike. Then there's the myth of Darwin's sudden epiphany about evolution while visiting the Galapagos Islands. In truth, Darwin's theory of natural selection evolved over decades. His notes from the Galapagos didn't immediately reveal the patterns he later described. It was only after returning home, analyzing samples, reading Malthus, and reflecting deeply that he formulated his ideas. The image of a lone explorer seeing evolution in real time among finches is compelling but wrong. It compresses years of thought into a single moment for dramatic effect. And while it may inspire, it also misleads. It erases the effort and doubt that fuel real discovery. Darwin wasn't gifted a sudden insight. He earned it through relentless study and cautious thinking. Another favorite falsehood, that people in the Middle Ages believed in a geocentric universe because they were backward and feared science. Actually, Many medieval scholars questioned the Earth-centered model and explored alternatives based on observation and reason. The heliocentric model had been proposed centuries earlier by thinkers like Aristarchus. It was the weight of tradition, not a lack of intelligence, that kept old models in place. And once the evidence was strong enough, the scientific community eventually shifted. What this myth overlooks is that science advances not by wiping out old ideas overnight, but by slowly testing, refining, and debating them. The Middle Ages weren't anti-science. That story just makes the modern era look smarter by comparison. And then there's the tale that Albert Einstein failed math as a student. This one is repeated to show that even geniuses struggle. It's meant to comfort and inspire, but it's not true. Einstein was ahead of his peers in math from a young age. The confusion likely comes from a misunderstanding of grading systems and a few early challenges in non-math subjects. Einstein wasn't a poor student. He was just a non-traditional thinker in a rigid system. The myth simplifies his complex journey into a feel-good fable. It ignores the persistence, frustration, and discipline behind his breakthroughs. Einstein's story is inspiring enough without fabricating failure. But we love the idea that greatness can come from unlikely places, even when the evidence says otherwise. Marie Curie's story is also often flattened into the tale of a lone woman battling sexism and radiation to win 2 Nobel Prizes. While she absolutely faced discrimination, and while her achievements are extraordinary, she didn't work in isolation. She collaborated with her husband Pierre and a team of researchers. Her discoveries were built on the efforts of many physicists and chemists before her. But narratives like to strip away complexity. They prefer lone heroes over collaborative efforts. Curie deserves every bit of recognition, but she wasn't the only genius in the room. Science isn't just the story of individuals. It's the story of networks, of rivalries, of support systems. That's harder to dramatize, but closer to the truth. One myth that's less heroic and more tragic is the belief that lemmings commit mass suicide by jumping off cliffs. This tale became popular after a 1958 Disney documentary staged such a scene for dramatic footage. In reality, lemmings migrate in large groups, and occasionally some die during these migrations. But they don't purposefully kill themselves. The myth spread quickly and has endured, despite being debunked. It shows how media can invent a biological story from spectacle and keep it alive for generations. That false footage rewrote nature's narrative. It turned a survival behavior into a symbol of blind self-destruction. Sometimes what we think is science is just clever editing. Finally, there's the long-standing idea that scientific revolutions are clean, linear stories of truth replacing error. But real science doesn't always work that way. Paradigm shifts are messy. Old ideas often coexist with new ones for years. Scientists argue. Evidence piles up slowly. The transition from Newtonian mechanics to Einstein's relativity wasn't a simple handoff. It was a complicated, often contentious evolution of understanding. And in many areas, even today, there's disagreement, uncertainty, and revision. The myth of instant clarity does a disservice to the process. Science isn't a series of magical moments. It's a grinding human effort, a quest full of setbacks, corrections, and imperfect people. But perhaps that makes the truth even more beautiful because it's earned. Chapter 5. The real Middle Ages wasn't so dark. For centuries, the term Dark Ages has cast a long and gloomy shadow over the medieval period. It conjures images of disease, ignorance, and an entire continent stumbling through darkness until the Renaissance brought light. But this image was crafted not by those who lived through the era, but by those who came after, eager to position themselves as superior. In truth, the Middle Ages were far more complex, vibrant, and forward-moving than popular history suggests. What we think of as darkness was often a glow hidden behind biased storytelling and Renaissance arrogance. To truly understand what the medieval world was like, we need to dig past the myths. It's a journey that takes us through libraries full of forgotten wisdom, across continents brimming with trade and innovation, and into cities that were far more organized than we've been led to believe. The so-called Dark Ages may have been many things, but dark in knowledge they were not. Let's start with the flat Earth myth. Many people still believe that medieval Europeans thought the world was flat. Schoolbooks and cartoons love to show early explorers sailing toward the edge of a pancake-shaped planet. But this misconception is just that, a myth. In fact, educated people in the Middle Ages understood the Earth was a sphere. The idea wasn't radical or forbidden. It was a standard part of astronomical teachings inherited from ancient Greek knowledge, preserved by both Christian and Islamic scholars. The real argument in Columbus's time wasn't whether the Earth was round. It was how big it was. The fear wasn't falling off the edge, but dying of thirst or starvation before reaching land. The flat Earth story was later exaggerated to make Columbus look braver and the people before him look dumber. In reality, medieval knowledge of the cosmos was more advanced than we usually admit. Then there's the myth that the Middle Ages were intellectually stagnant. We're told that once Rome fell, all learning vanished, and Europeans became mindless peasants for 1,000 years. But the truth lies in the monasteries, universities, and libraries of medieval Europe. Monks copied and preserved thousands of ancient texts: mathematics, medicine, philosophy. The first universities appeared in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. They debated logic, dissected Aristotle's works, and pioneered subjects like law and theology. Even science had a seat at the table. Astronomy, optics, and natural philosophy flourished under thinkers like Roger Bacon and Hildegard of Bingen. Far from being a time of ignorance, the Middle Ages laid the foundations for the scientific explosion that came later. The narrative of a 1,000-year intellectual drought is not just wrong. It's deeply unfair to the people who studied, calculated, and theorized in candlelit rooms across Europe. Cleanliness is another part of the medieval story that's been distorted. We're often told people in the Middle Ages never bathed, stank to high heaven, and lived among their own waste. But archaeological evidence and historical records paint a different picture. Public bathhouses existed in cities like London and Paris, often inspired by Roman models. People understood the importance of hygiene, especially during plague outbreaks. Personal grooming, like nail trimming, hair brushing, and laundering, was common. Yes, not everyone had access to luxurious baths, and hygiene declined in some regions after certain invasions or plagues. But the image of a filthy, lice-ridden population wallowing in mud is more fantasy than fact. In many cases, later writers projected their own disdain onto the past, using hygiene, or the lack of it, as a tool to dehumanize earlier generations. The truth is more nuanced, and sometimes surprisingly fresh. Another myth worth dismantling is the idea that medieval people never traveled or interacted with the wider world. The term globalization might be modern, but the concept isn't. Medieval Europe was far from isolated. Viking traders reached the Middle East. Venetian merchants sailed to Asia. Pilgrims crossed thousands of miles to reach Jerusalem, while crusaders returned with silk, spices, and knowledge from the Islamic world. Muslim scholars translated Greek philosophy into Arabic and passed it along to European counterparts. Trade routes stretched from Scandinavia to sub-Saharan Africa. Even in the supposedly dark north, bustling markets hummed with goods from distant lands. The Silk Road wasn't just a story of Marco Polo. It was a bridge between civilizations. If the Middle Ages were closed off, how did medieval maps show places like India and China? The truth is, medieval society was deeply connected, both economically and intellectually, to a broader global web. One of the cruelest myths is that medieval people were constantly violent, barbaric, and incapable of governance. This idea paints the Middle Ages as a lawless wasteland of knights hacking at each other over sheep and kings ruling with sheer brutality. While violence did exist, just as it does in any era, the legal systems of the time were surprisingly structured. Courts of law operated in towns. Charters and contracts were used to protect rights. Guilds regulated commerce and workers' rights. Feudalism itself, despite its flaws, was a system of mutual obligation, not chaos. Even warfare had codes of conduct, like the early chivalric rules or the Peace and Truce of God movement, which aimed to limit violence among Christians. The myth of a blood-soaked, irrational era comes more from modern disdain than historical truth. Medieval people lived under rules, customs, and agreements, sometimes brutal, often complex, always evolving. The supposed dominance of religion over every part of medieval life also needs context. It's easy to imagine that the church controlled all thought and suppressed every new idea. But the relationship between faith and intellect was far more dynamic. Many scholars were clergy. Monasteries were centers of study. Debates between science and theology took place in public forums and universities. Figures like Thomas Aquinas worked to harmonize reason with belief. And heresies, even though punished, often reflected active engagement with theological issues, not blind obedience. Yes, there were times of censorship and dogma, but there was also space for inquiry, discussion, and even dissent. The church was not a monolith, and medieval spirituality was diverse, ranging from mystics to reformers. The oversimplified story of religion smothering all thought ignores the lively intellectual atmosphere that shaped much of Europe's spiritual and academic evolution. Let's talk about art and architecture, often dismissed as crude or depressing. Gothic cathedrals were not just symbols of power. They were masterpieces of engineering and beauty. Stained glass windows told elaborate stories. Sculptures captured emotion and symbolism with remarkable precision. Illuminated manuscripts turned pages into canvases. Music, too, evolved. Polyphonic compositions, chant traditions, and early notation systems emerged during this time. Far from being aesthetically barren, the Middle Ages were a period of intense creativity. Art was infused with meaning, sometimes religious, sometimes political, always intentional. The notion that only the Renaissance produced beauty overlooks the breathtaking accomplishments that preceded it. Many Renaissance artists were, in fact, building on medieval traditions, not rebelling against them. The Middle Ages didn't just preserve culture. They expanded it in ways that still echo in today's concert halls and cathedrals. Another enduring misconception is that medieval medicine was pure superstition. It's true that treatments like bloodletting and astrology played a role, but medical knowledge was broader than we're led to believe. Medieval doctors studied texts from Greece, Rome, and the Islamic world. They categorized illnesses, conducted surgeries, and even developed early hospitals. Hygiene practices in monasteries and some urban centers rivaled those of later periods. Herbal remedies were not random guesses. They were rooted in centuries of accumulated knowledge. The University of Salerno, for instance, was a renowned medical school long before the Enlightenment. The idea that no one knew how the body worked until modern times is a historical blind spot. Yes, they lacked modern tools, but they were not ignorant. They observed, experimented, and learned just as we do now. The Black Death, while catastrophic, didn't plunge Europe into total chaos forever. The plague hit hard, no question, but it also led to major social changes. Labor shortages empowered workers. Serfdom began to unravel. New technologies emerged. Cities reorganized. Public health reforms began to take shape. Some communities even used the tragedy as a chance to rethink their way of life. It wasn't just death, it was also transformation. The image of a society collapsing under the weight of rats and despair ignores the resilience and reinvention that followed. People mourned, yes, but they also adapted. History is rarely just disaster or triumph. It's usually both happening at the same time. And in this case, the so-called dark chapter helped light the path to a new age. Education wasn't just for monks and nobles. Many towns had schools, and literacy, especially among tradespeople and merchants, was higher than assumed. Women were educated too, particularly in convents or noble households. Literature in vernacular languages flourished, with works like the Divine Comedy and the Canterbury Tales reflecting rich intellectual life outside Latin circles. Storytelling, poetry, and philosophical debate were not confined to elites. Even among peasants, oral traditions and folk knowledge carried immense cultural weight. The myth that medieval people couldn't read or write en masse erases the diversity of learning styles and access. Education was uneven, yes, but not absent, and certainly not hopeless. So where did the myth of the Dark Ages come from? Ironically, it was the Renaissance that cast its medieval predecessors in shadow. Renaissance thinkers saw themselves as revivers of lost glory, and to shine brighter, they dimmed the past. Later, Enlightenment writers reinforced the divide, painting the Middle Ages as a time of superstition and stagnation, just to elevate reason and science. The label stuck. Textbooks, art, and movies repeated the lie. And soon, we believed that for 1,000 years, nothing happened worth remembering. But now, historians are rewriting the story. The Middle Ages were complex, rich, and vital to the development of our modern world. The darkness we imagined was never really there. We just weren't looking close enough. Chapter 6. Famous figures who never were or weren't so famous. It's easy to think of history as a grand stage with unforgettable characters playing out well-documented roles. But what if some of those characters never even existed? Or if they were real, what if the parts they played were wildly exaggerated? This chapter dives deep into the fabled figures we've accepted as real for generations. Icons of legend, lore, and nationalism, only to uncover how fiction crept into fact. Robin Hood, the supposed noble outlaw of Sherwood Forest, likely never existed in the form we imagine. While there were medieval outlaws with similar names, The familiar story of stealing from the rich to give to the poor is a literary invention that evolved over centuries. Ballads, poems, and plays shaped him into a hero for the people. But at the root, he may have just been a name borrowed to rally the oppressed or a symbol of protest more than a man of flesh and blood. Another legendary name that enters classrooms and cartoons alike is Lady Godiva. Most believe she rode naked through the streets to protest taxes, a powerful image of defiance and vulnerability. But early records of the event are suspiciously quiet about any such ride. The earliest known account comes long after her supposed lifetime, told by a monk with a taste for drama. Historians suspect her tale was concocted to glorify a noble family or entertain the masses rather than preserve truth. And the infamous Peeping Tom? He was added even later, likely as a cautionary tale about voyeurism. The real Lady Godiva did exist, but she was known for religious donations and piety, not public nudity. Her transformation into a legendary rebel reflects the human need to reshape history into compelling narratives that fit social values of the time. We also arrive at the curious case of Mulan, the fearless Chinese heroine who disguised herself as a man to take her father's place in battle. While deeply embedded in Chinese culture today, the origins of Mulan lie in a poem, not in a historical archive. The Ballad of Mulan, written during the Northern Wei dynasty, speaks of her bravery, but offers no concrete evidence that she ever lived. No military records or tombs link her to real events. Still, over the centuries, her story morphed into a national legend, used to inspire patriotism, gender empowerment, and family loyalty. Yet the absence of proof suggests she is more symbol than person, crafted from cultural imagination rather than carved from lived experience. And still, she endures, reshaped through dynasties, regimes, and Disney animations. One of the most controversial names that straddles the line between real and myth is King Arthur, a heroic ruler wielding Excalibur, seated at the round table with noble knights. His tale pulses through British folklore and national identity. But historians have found no solid archaeological or textual proof of his existence. What they have found are hints of a possible war leader or Roman-affiliated soldier in post-Roman Britain, whose fragmented deeds were embellished over generations. Arthur's first detailed appearance comes centuries after his supposed reign, in tales clearly intended for political and moral storytelling. The sword, the wizard Merlin, and the Holy Grail, additions layered over time. King Arthur may have started as a footnote in tribal conflicts, but he grew into a mythic monarch not through memory, but through the hands of storytellers. And then there's William Tell, the Swiss folk hero famous for shooting an apple off his son's head. His story is taught as national pride in Switzerland, a bold resistance against tyranny. But historical investigation suggests the tale might have been imported from earlier Germanic folklore, with similar stories appearing across Europe. No contemporary records of Tell exist, and the supposed crossbow shot might have been a borrowed motif to promote rebellion and national unity during Swiss struggles for independence. The figure of Tell served more as a rallying cry than a confirmed person. While symbols of resistance are crucial to building national stories, it becomes clear that William Tell is likely a fictional creation passed off as historical fact. We can't forget about Prester John, a mythical Christian king believed to rule a vast, exotic kingdom in the East. For centuries, European explorers searched for him, thinking he held unimaginable riches and could help in the Crusades. Letters claimed to be from Prester John circulated throughout Europe, filled with wild descriptions of his empire. Yet none of it was real. He was a medieval fabrication, an illusion born from desperation and curiosity. The myth of Prester John spurred expeditions, influenced geopolitics, and even justified conquest. But there was no such king, just fabricated letters and fantastical maps drawn from wishful thinking. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes belief alone can reshape the course of history, even if the object of belief never existed. Even modern historical figures haven't escaped fictional retellings. Take Betsy Ross, often credited with sewing the first American flag. Generations of schoolchildren were taught her role in the founding mythos. But there's little to no contemporary documentation supporting that she made the first flag or had a meeting with George Washington as commonly told. The story only emerged decades later, promoted by her descendants. Over time, it was embraced and taught as fact, symbolizing patriotism and feminine contribution to American independence. While Ross was a real person and did sew flags, the specific tale of the first flag appears to be more myth than history, crafted to include women in the revolutionary narrative during a time of nation-building. There's also the haunting story of Rasputin, the so-called Mad Monk of Russia, whispered to have mystical powers and unmatched influence over the last Tsar's family. His assassination is depicted as an epic tale of poison, gunshots, and drowning, with each attempt failing as if he were unkillable. But many of these details were exaggerated after his death, meant to paint him as a demonic figure responsible for the fall of an empire. In truth, Rasputin was a charismatic mystic with a flair for drama, but much of what we believe about his powers and death was created by enemies and political opportunists. He did die violently, but not quite in the fantasy-like sequence that's often told. We must also confront Pocahontas, a figure caught between myth and reality. Her real story, as recorded in colonial accounts, differs drastically from the romanticized version told in books and films. She was around 10 years old when she first met John Smith, not the adult heroine many stories depict. The tale of her saving Smith's life may have been exaggerated or misinterpreted. Later, she was kidnapped, converted, and married off to an English settler. Her image was softened and repurposed to sell colonial narratives and justify the European presence in the New World. The real Pocahontas was a victim of manipulation, not the free-spirited ambassador of peace portrayed in popular culture. Then there's the tale of El Cid, Spain's national hero, celebrated in epic poetry as a loyal Christian knight who fought against Muslim invaders. The truth is far more complex. Rodrigo Diaz, the man behind the legend, was a mercenary who fought for both Christian and Muslim rulers depending on who paid better. He wasn't always noble or loyal, and many of his deeds were strategically rewritten centuries later to align with nationalistic goals. The real man was ruthless, practical, and very much a product of his time. But the version of El Cid many know is filtered through layers of myth-making meant to inspire and unify rather than to reflect reality. Lastly, we arrive at the curious case of John Henry, the steel-driving man who supposedly raced a steam drill and died victorious. He symbolizes human spirit triumphing over machines. But evidence for his actual existence is scarce, and the story aligns more with folk hero tradition than factual biography. Songs and tall tales shaped him into a cultural icon during times of rapid industrialization, offering hope in the face of mechanized labor. Like Paul Bunyan or Pecos Bill, John Henry probably never existed as described. But his story filled a gap where workers needed strength, identity, and pride in the face of societal change. History gave them that truth or not. These 10 stories remind us how easily fiction becomes fact when the right emotions are stirred. People need heroes, rebels, saints, and symbols. Sometimes they come from real people whose stories are twisted. Other times they're entirely imagined. But all of them teach us that history is not just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember, retell, and believe. And the line between memory and myth is often thinner than we care to admit. Chapter 7: Misquoted, Misremembered, and Misplaced. It always starts with a clever phrase, something short, easy to remember. It spreads like wildfire across textbooks, documentaries, and memes. And before long, it becomes cemented as fact. But what if many of the world's most famous quotes and historical phrases were never actually said, or were taken completely out of context? These stories are like mirrors, reflecting not the people who supposedly said them, but the myths we wanted to believe. This chapter dives into a curious collection of misquotes, mixed memories, and phrases that were never meant to be legendary, but somehow became scripture in the book of history. Behind every powerful line you thought you knew is a trail of miscommunication, pop culture reinvention, or outright fabrication. These aren't just small mistakes. They shaped how we view our heroes, our values, and our identity. And some of them are so deeply rooted, the truth may never fully replace the fiction. Everyone knows Albert Einstein was a genius, but the phrase most tied to him, about insanity being doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, was not his. The quote appears nowhere in his writings or speeches. It was actually first found in a 1980s Narcotics Anonymous handbook. But because it sounds like something a brilliant thinker might say, people attached it to Einstein and the myth stuck. The irony is that Einstein spent much of his life challenging repetition and convention, making the quote especially tempting to associate with him. But the reality is more complicated, and it shows how hungry we are to anchor our beliefs in names that carry authority. We crave wisdom from giants of thought, even if we have to invent it. That one misattribution turned a recovery manual into an accidental history rewrite. Next comes a phrase often thrown around in political speeches and patriotic rallies: let them eat cake. Most attribute it to Marie Antoinette, using it as proof of her disconnect from the starving poor. But there's no credible evidence she ever said it. In fact, the phrase existed in literature years before she even arrived in France. The story may have originated from propaganda designed to turn public sentiment against the monarchy. And it worked. The quote became shorthand for elite indifference, and Marie became a villain in the pages of revolutionary lore. But in truth, she was a foreign teenager thrown into French politics and hated for it. This myth, repeated for centuries, reminds us how a single sentence, especially one never actually said, can doom someone's legacy forever. Then there's Paul Revere. His Midnight Ride is legendary in American history, but the famous cry, "The British are coming," was never shouted. For one thing, most colonists still considered themselves British. Revere was more discreet, likely saying something like the regulars are coming out to avoid alarming loyalists. His ride was real, but the drama around it was later embellished by poets and patriots eager to forge a national myth. Revere became a symbol, not of the man he was, but of the revolutionary spirit the young nation wanted to idolize. That transformation turned him from messenger to myth, and the truth was quietly left behind in favor of a more thrilling story. Abraham Lincoln is another figure whose words have been twisted by time. While he did give many memorable speeches, there's one that never happened: his supposed letter to a schoolteacher about raising a good boy. It's a favorite among moralists and educators, but it wasn't written by Lincoln. The letter first appeared in a 1950s magazine column, and historians have since confirmed it's a fake, but it keeps resurfacing, especially on social media, often framed with a grainy portrait of Lincoln to give it extra weight. This shows how desperate we are to have history's icons validate our present-day values. When the real Lincoln doesn't speak clearly enough to modern concerns, we invent a version who will. Even modern figures aren't safe. Nelson Mandela is often credited with the powerful words about our deepest fear being that we are powerful beyond measure. That quote shows up on posters, calendars, and graduation speeches, but it was actually written by author Marianne Williamson. Mandela never spoke those lines in any of his speeches. Still, the association stuck because it fit the mythic version of Mandela as a spiritual leader and global icon. This misquote reveals how our collective memory reshapes itself to serve emotion over accuracy. It's not enough that someone said something meaningful, we need the right person to say it. Then there's the strange tale of Sherlock Holmes. Most believe the detective's catchphrase was elementary, "My dear Watson." But in all of Arthur Conan Doyle's original writings, Holmes never said it. The phrase came from later film adaptations, where screenwriters wanted to distill his intellect into a single line. Over time, that one-liner became more iconic than anything Holmes actually said. And soon, people began to assume the quote was lifted from the books. This phenomenon is part of a broader trend, where movies rewrite literature in the public imagination. We remember the cinematic version, not the original source. Another famous line falsely attributed is "Be the change you wish to see in the world," often linked to Mahatma Gandhi. While the sentiment does reflect his philosophy, there is no evidence he ever spoke those exact words. The quote became popular through Western self-help culture, which often compresses complex philosophies into digestible slogans. Gandhi's actual speeches were nuanced and deeply tied to specific political strategies, not bumper sticker wisdom. But the simplicity of the phrase helped it spread, and Gandhi's name gave it moral authority. The truth, once again, was overwritten by the story people preferred. Julius Caesar's last words are often remembered as "You too, Brutus?" But that line comes from Shakespeare's dramatization, not from Roman history. Ancient sources don't agree on Caesar's final words. Some even suggest he said nothing at all. Yet the betrayal captured in that line became so emotionally powerful that it replaced historical uncertainty. Shakespeare gave the assassination a tragic humanity that the real event may have lacked. This is one of the clearest examples of fiction becoming fact in the public mind. A playwright, not a historian, gave us the most famous death scene in political history. Even events as tragic as the Titanic disaster aren't immune. The band playing on as the ship sank is a romanticized detail that may not be fully accurate. Survivors gave conflicting reports, and it's unclear whether music was still playing in those final moments. Yet the story endures because it offers a glimpse of courage amid chaos. That imagined soundtrack adds drama, nobility, and grace to a catastrophe that otherwise might have seemed only terrifying. Once again, storytelling overpowers uncertain truth. And once again, history is rewritten not by lies, but by yearning for beauty in horror. A particularly strange myth is that Napoleon was short. The truth is he was average height for his time, about 5'6" or 7" in modern measurements. The confusion came from a mix-up between French and English units, combined with British propaganda that wanted to belittle their enemy. Over time, the idea of a tiny, angry general became a cultural trope, inspiring everything from jokes to psychological theories. It's a lesson in how even physical facts can be distorted by enemies, retold by artists, and embedded into collective imagination. What started as an insult turned into an accepted reality. Lastly, let's turn to a recent misremembering, one that proves the pattern never stops. Many people believe that Mr. Rogers wore sweaters to cover up tattoos from military service. But Fred Rogers was never in the military. He wore sweaters because his mother knitted them. Still, the myth persists, because people love hidden depth, especially when it involves transformation. The gentle TV host hiding a warrior past fits a narrative we crave, that beneath kindness lies power. But the truth is simpler and far more human. Rogers was exactly who he appeared to be. Sometimes the story we invent says more about us than it does about history. These false quotes, misremembered phrases, and misplaced identities may seem harmless, but they show just how fragile historical truth really is. Memory, media, and myth are constantly rewriting the record. And unless we question what we think we know, we'll continue to pass down fiction in the name of fact. The next time you hear a powerful quote, ask where it came from. The answer might surprise you, or it might reveal a story far stranger than the one you've always believed. Chapter 8: Mistaken Identities in Religion and Culture. It begins with a bite, or so we were told. The story of Eve and the forbidden fruit is etched deep into cultural consciousness, yet nowhere in ancient scripture is an apple ever mentioned. The fruit was never named. The idea of it being an apple took root centuries later in Europe, not because of theology but because of a linguistic coincidence. In Latin, the word for evil and apple is nearly identical. That small confusion eventually reshaped how the world imagined the birth of sin. Countless paintings, sculptures, and sermons solidified the image. The apple was never about truth. It was about art and influence. And once that imagery took hold, it was nearly impossible to correct. This is how many beliefs evolve, not through facts, but through repetition. It's not just a fruit. It's a symbol twisted by culture, misinterpreted through centuries, and passed down as if it had always been there from the start. Then there's the nativity scene that shows up each December. A quiet barn, animals gathered, 3 wise men bowing near a manger. It's comforting, it's familiar, and it's almost entirely constructed centuries after the fact. The earliest texts don't give a specific number of visitors. The idea that there were 3 wise men was based only on the number of gifts mentioned: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. As for the setting, it likely wasn't a barn at all. Middle Eastern homes often had built-in spaces for animals, meaning Jesus was probably born in a relative's home, not some far-off stable. Even the date, December 25th, was borrowed from pagan winter festivals, chosen for convenience and symbolism rather than historical accuracy. These details aren't harmless decorations. They shape how people understand a foundational event. And when the myths go unchallenged, they become more powerful than the truth itself. Another case involves one of history's most iconic figures, Mary Magdalene. For centuries, she was painted as a repentant prostitute, a sinner turned saint. But that characterization came not from Scripture, but from a 6th century pope who merged her identity with another unnamed woman. No such detail existed in the original texts. She was actually a close follower of Jesus, someone deeply involved in his teachings and resurrection story. But branding her as a former harlot reduced her role, made her less threatening to the male-dominated church hierarchy. It's a story of erasure hidden inside a sermon, and it's stuck for over 1,000 years. Only in modern times has scholarship begun to restore her true position in religious history. Yet even now, the false version lingers in popular culture. One decision by one man reshaped the image of a major religious figure, and most people never even noticed. Let's talk about Satan, the horned, red-skinned demon with a pitchfork and cloven hooves. He's instantly recognizable in pop culture. But where did that image come from? The Bible offers only fragmented, symbolic descriptions of evil. The modern image of the devil is an amalgamation of pagan gods like Pan, early Christian fears, and later medieval art. Over time, these images hardened into a standard form. But this caricature was more of a propaganda tool than a scriptural truth. It helped the church frame outsiders, heretics, or rebels as devilish. That grotesque image you picture isn't from ancient theology. It's from medieval theater and Renaissance paintings. And once the image was planted in people's minds, it stuck. What was once symbolic became literal, a being formed more by artists and fear than by any divine manuscript. Even the 10 Commandments, often cited as a moral foundation, are not as singular as people assume. There isn't one definitive list. In fact, multiple versions appear in the Bible with slightly different wording and even order. What's often presented on courthouse lawns or classroom posters is a composite list, shaped by religious tradition rather than Scripture itself. Different faiths, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, have varying versions. The notion that there's one authoritative set of rules etched in stone isn't historically accurate. It's the result of centuries of theological editing. But because that list has been enshrined in monuments and memory, it feels immutable. This misbelief isn't just about ancient tablets. It's about how religion and law were merged in public consciousness without the nuance of the original texts. Let's not forget Noah's Arkansas. The story of a global flood wiping out nearly all life is often treated as literal history. But many cultures have flood myths, and scholars now see the story in Genesis as part of a broader Mesopotamian tradition. The ark, as described in biblical texts, would have been physically impossible to build with ancient tools and materials. Geological evidence doesn't support a global flood either. Yet it's still taught in some circles as historical fact. What began as myth, possibly metaphor, evolved into a supposed event. The danger is not in believing the story's symbolism. It's in mistaking allegory for archaeology. Stories that may have once offered spiritual meaning became confused with records of literal history, which reshaped entire worldviews in ways that still ripple today. Then there's the idea that Islam was spread solely by the sword. This is a common refrain, often used to paint an entire faith as violent. But the historical spread of Islam was complex. While some regions experienced conquest, others embraced the religion through trade, diplomacy, and shared culture. In places like Indonesia, Islam arrived via merchants and scholars, not armies. This myth ignores the nuance of history and feeds into modern prejudice. It also mirrors similar narratives applied to Christianity and other faiths during their periods of expansion. By reducing a global religion's growth to violence alone, history becomes weaponized. These simplifications aren't just wrong, they're dangerous. They erase context, fuel stereotypes, and distort the real forces that shape religious history across continents. There's also the deeply embedded myth that Hinduism is one unified religion with a single set of beliefs. In truth, what we call Hinduism is a vast, diverse collection of traditions, philosophies, and rituals that evolved over millennia. The British colonial powers grouped them together for administrative convenience. Before that, people identified with local deities, texts, or spiritual practices, many of which differed significantly. Even the term Hindu was originally a geographical reference. The idea of a single, codified religion came much later, shaped by politics, colonialism, and nationalist movements. Today, this unifying label erases the rich complexity of South Asia's spiritual heritage. It shows how the simple act of naming something can alter its entire history, and how modern definitions often overwrite ancient truths. Let's explore a different type of myth, the notion that the Crusades were purely religious wars. While religion played a major role, the motivations were far messier. Many crusaders were seeking land, wealth, and status. Some were criminals offered redemption through violence. Political power plays between rival kingdoms, and the papacy drove much of the conflict. The Crusades were often framed as a holy mission, but the actions taken were rarely holy. Cities were looted, non-combatants were massacred. Alliances shifted based on convenience, not piety. The myth of noble warriors fighting for divine purpose masks the brutal chaos of medieval geopolitics. And yet, the Crusades are still used today in political rhetoric, often devoid of context. It's another case of a complicated story simplified into a moral fable, and history suffers for it. Then comes the tale of Buddha's sudden enlightenment under a tree. While this moment is iconic, it's not quite as spontaneous as legends suggest. Siddhartha Gautama's journey was long and filled with teachings, mentorships, and experiments with different philosophies. His eventual awakening was the culmination of a slow transformation, not a magical instant of divine wisdom. But the story of one night under the Bodhi tree is cleaner, more cinematic. Over time, that became the dominant narrative. It doesn't negate the meaning of his realization, it just oversimplifies it. Myths form because people crave clarity, but clarity often comes at the cost of accuracy. Even spiritual figures as profound as Buddha are not spared from the need to compress life into legend. Finally, we come to the Tower of Babel, a story often used to explain the origin of languages. It describes a time when humanity tried to build a tower to the heavens. But archaeological evidence doesn't support the idea of one singular event where language fractured. Instead, languages evolved gradually, influenced by migration, isolation, and time. The story may have been inspired by ancient ziggurats in Mesopotamia, which were towering religious structures. But the tale is symbolic, a metaphor for human pride and diversity, not a literal history. Still, it's been used for centuries to justify linguistic division or cultural superiority. Like so many stories in this chapter, it warns us of what happens when metaphor is mistaken for memory and symbols are rewritten as fact. Religion and culture often offer meaning, but when history is sacrificed in the process, the truth gets lost in the telling. Chapter 9: America's Invented Past. It begins with a dinner table image: pilgrims in black hats, Native Americans offering corn, everyone smiling over turkey. It's an image printed in textbooks, mounted in classrooms, reenacted in school plays. But that sanitized Thanksgiving never happened the way we were told. The original 1621 feast was likely a tense and awkward survival gathering. The pilgrims weren't noble freedom seekers. They were separatists, deeply religious, suspicious of outsiders, and not as friendly as the myth makes them out to be. The Wampanoag weren't invited for a holiday. They showed up after hearing gunfire, assuming a battle was taking place. There was food, yes, but it wasn't turkey and pumpkin pie. It was venison, shellfish, and boiled vegetables.
No toul hats, no buckled shoes.
The peaceful meal we picture is a post-Civil War invention, meant to promote unity in a nation still divided. The real story is far messier, far more human, and far more forgotten. Then comes the tale of Paul Revere. You can almost hear the gallop in your head. The British are coming. Midnight ride. Lanterns in a tower. But Revere never shouted those words. Most colonists still saw themselves as British at the time. His mission was secret, meant to warn revolutionaries without tipping off loyalists. In fact, he didn't even finish the ride. He was captured, and others, like William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, actually carried the warning farther. But Revere had something the others didn't: a good publicist. His legend grew in later retellings, molded by nationalistic poetry and eager schoolteachers. He became a symbol of individual heroism. Clean, simple story. And so, the complex network of writers was replaced by one lone patriot. It's not that he didn't matter. It's that the story leaves out everyone else who did. George Washington, the father of a nation, is often portrayed as a flawless hero. But even he was wrapped in fiction. That famous cherry tree story?
Totale fabrication.
It appeared decades after his death, invented by a biographer who wanted to showcase moral virtue. Washington never confessed to chopping a tree out of honesty. It was never about trees, it was about shaping an ideal citizen. The same goes for the wooden teeth. He did have dental problems, yes, but his dentures were made from ivory, human teeth, and even horse teeth, not wood. Why the wood myth? Because it softened the image, made him more humble, more relatable. These stories weren't about truth. They were about creating a character Americans could admire, teach to children, and mold into myth. Let's move west now, to the land of cowboys and saloons. The Wild West, as we know it, barely existed. Gunfights were rare. Most frontier towns had strict weapon laws, and many outlaws were more bark than bite. Wyatt Earp, for example, is often cast as a fearless lawman. But in truth, he had a criminal past and questionable motives. Buffalo Bill Cody. His shows turned real history into dramatic fiction. Native Americans played themselves in these spectacles, reenacting battles that were actually massacres. The myth of the lone cowboy taming the wild was just that, a myth. In reality, many cowboys were Mexican, black, or native. The West was diverse, regulated, and more mundane than the movies suggest. But fantasy sells, so that's what stuck. Even the Liberty Bell has its legend. It's said to have rung out on July 4th, 1776, announcing independence to a cheering crowd. But there's no evidence that happened. The bell was cracked long before and barely rang at all. Its famous fracture grew worse over time, and the bell most people visit today hasn't been used in centuries. So why does the image endure? Because it's powerful. A cracked bell that still stands symbolizes a country born imperfect but enduring. Truth isn't always as poetic, so history made it rhyme even if it never rang. And what about the idea that America was founded on religious freedom? That's only half true. The Puritans came to escape persecution, but they quickly imposed their own rigid systems. They banned dissent, jailed Quakers, hung so-called witches. Tolerance wasn't the goal. It was conformity under a new banner. Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, more tolerant colonies, were exceptions, not the rule. The myth of universal freedom hid a history of selective liberty. It wasn't about embracing all faiths. It was about securing power for a chosen few. The image of Betsy Ross sewing the first American flag is another stitched-together story. The tale emerged nearly a century later, told by her grandson with no documentation to back it up. She did make flags, many people did, but there's no proof she designed the stars and stripes. The story persisted because it offered a female hero in a male-dominated founding myth. It also helped personalize the revolution. Instead of faceless rebellion, we got a grandmother with a needle shaping history from her parlor. It was a comforting image, easier to teach than the messy, political truth. Then there's the Emancipation Proclamation. It's remembered as the document that freed the slaves. But it didn't free all of them, just those in Confederate states where the Union had no control. Slavery continued in border states like Kentucky and Delaware until months later. Lincoln's move was strategic, aimed at weakening the South's labor force and strengthening moral support for the war. Freedom came in steps, not in one grand gesture. But the simplified story turns moral complexity into mythic clarity. A clean break from evil. A nation redeemed. History likes to skip the nuance. Rosie the Riveter is often held up as a symbol of World War II's empowered working woman. But the real story behind the poster is more complicated. The iconic image wasn't even widely known during the war. It was rediscovered decades later and retroactively linked to an effort that involved thousands of women, but also excluded many others. Black women, for example, were often denied these industrial jobs. When the war ended, most female workers were pushed out of factories. The symbol survived because it felt empowering, but it glossed over the limits of that empowerment. The real Rosie wasn't one woman. She was a patchwork myth, sewn together by marketing and memory. Finally, let's revisit the Founding Fathers, the architects of liberty. The Constitution, the Declaration, the birth of democracy. But the reality was exclusionary. Most of the signers owned slaves. Women had no rights. Indigenous people were erased from the conversation entirely, yet we're taught to see it all as a noble beginning. The myth isn't that these men wrote the documents. The myth is that they represented everyone. In truth, they represented property-owning white men and built a system for people like themselves. The story was later expanded, edited, reinterpreted. But its origins were narrow. That's not unpatriotic to say. It's just part of growing up as a nation. So much of America's past was sculpted, not remembered. It was curated, trimmed, and polished for classroom walls and national celebrations. The rough edges were sanded down, the contradictions ignored. But these myths weren't just innocent misunderstandings. They shaped laws, informed values, and decided who got to be seen as part of the story. To understand what America is, we have to first understand what it isn't. We were sold tales of freedom, bravery, and unity. But behind the legends are real people, flawed, complex, and often left out. And once we see them, we can begin to see the truth of how the past really shaped the present.